when we think of territory, we tend to assume we know exactly what it is, and we don't tend to question our visual imaginaries that we associate with territories. So it's maybe I focus a little bit more on the more visual slides. So this book is the culmination of PhD thesis on the topic, and originally I had a very simple question, which was just to examine this question of deterritorialization, or why territory is no longer of relevance to international law. I had come at my dissertation with a fairly naive question, and I think many PhDs start off in this direction. But as I was reading more, and especially outside of law, I realized that that wasn't really what the issue was. The issue was more that international law couldn't see any of the other territories. And so it's not that territory mattered less, it's just there's a very restrictive view of territory. So this is where the project has come from, and my thinking is continuing to evolve. And so I'm also keen to hear from you guys what you've made of the argument, and I also just would love to know why, even though you wanted a whole course on the territoriality of international law, I think this sounds fascinating, and I think you're super lucky to have Lorenzo as a teacher. He's an amazing thinker. So this is the kind of the rebirth of territory, if you like. So it starts off the book anyway with diagnosing what I think this problem is in international law, which is what I had picked up on was not just increasing discourse and assumptions, but there was also an underlying anxiety and pathological anxiety almost amongst international lawyers about the displacement of territory by phenomena associated with global governance, global law, and globalization. And international organizations and multinational corporations are two that you've looked at in the class. And it's just this idea that territory is becoming less important. This is so this quote comes from a Netherlands yearbook of international law special issue that was done on territoriality of international law, and you may have even looked at this as part of your reading. And I was sensing this idea that this quote very much diagnoses the relationship between state and territory as being one of the most characteristic feature of the state. So there's such an essentialized relationship between the state and territory. And there was this continual message that I was reading as part of this anxiety exploring these topics, which was territoriality still is very significant to our regime. And so there was this constant push and pull in the arguments where a lot of scholars would go would foray into trying to explore what's happened, but then they always retreat to this but territory still matters kind of argument, and I was quite curious about it. And my overall argument in relation to this is there's a failure to understand the complexity of the spatial dynamics of global law and governance, and that international lawyers can't see reterritorialization, they only see deterritorialization. So you can diagnose this in various different discourses. So it's not just from international law. Luhmann wrote on this much earlier than many others and spoke about this model of a global society without any apex or center. This is also very much following Kelsen and others, where there's no central government, because we still have this kind of obsession with state apparatus, and even as trying to make global society as state apparatus. Gunther Teubner and Fischer Lascano also, Gunther Teubner does a lot on pluralism and law, and they, together with Fischer Lascano, they wrote on very much also following Luhmann, but again, this idea that there is no apex, no center. There is now an idea that sectoral fragmentation, so trade law, investment law, human rights, law of the sea, overlay traditional territoriality. And so there's this more functional ordering for these transnational legal regimes, and they overlay, which is a spatial metaphor in and of itself, like it sits on top of, if you like, at a higher global level over state territory. And Kiki Broman, or Catherine Broman, also diagnosed this from within international law, and very much looked at the likes of ICANN, ISOC, and other, as she puts it, non-statal and non-territorial transnational private networks, shows that there is a decline in the role of territory in international law, and not just in the discipline of, but also in the actual functioning of the legal regime. And so I was also at the same time diagnosing, as I've mentioned, this counter narrative of territory still matters. It comes in numerous different forms, and I was always wondering why this was happening. And I think there are several reasons for this. One key one is that the alternative, is non-territorial or aterritorial, and I argue entirely despatialized accounts. So functionalism or sectoral regimes arguments just take the globe at large, and they therefore lose any, I say they lose sight of, but they just lose any critical faculty to understand the spaces of these political and legal realities. And I was frustrated reading much of this scholarship because they just now seem to float free in this global space. And when you turn to critical geography as a discipline, and the field was talking about, well, actually, quite clearly, there is a logic to capital, there is a logic to trade, there is a logic to global value chains. And people do not just interact with space or move through it at random like billiard balls. We all are disciplined in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our cities, in the railway lines that we participate in. And if we can think of this at a domestic level, that we are very much shaped by our environment, and we also need to accept that at global or international level, states, corporations, and international organizations also do not. So my argument was, in the very first kind of substantive chapter of the book, is that this is an incomplete account, that there is no reterritorialization. And I go back to Deleuze and Guattari, who were the main, or the kind of one of the main touch points of thinking about deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And if you want, you can have a read of their work, but you have to be very patient with it. But they, in essence, argue that deterritorialization and reterritorialization are always connected and caught up in one another, that every single process brings about de and reterritorialization. And so there's a really incredible thinker, Stuart Eldon, and I riff in many ways off of his book, which is called The Birth of Territory, which was very influential. And he argues that there's a continual process of de and reterritorialization, and we instead have a reconfiguration of spatial relations rather than their end. So we're never just deterritorialization, there's always what he calls a complementary reterritorialization. And so I was curious as to why international law could not see this. And so international lawyers, even where they were trying desperately to figure out exactly why territory was less important, even in doing so, they tend to reproduce a very orthodox, very specific, and very particular concept of territory, which is often actually best displayed by this idea of the map. And it's a concept of territory that is orthodox to international law, but not only international law. IR very much can work with a very similar visual imaginary, even though there has been lots of work by the likes of John Agnew and Nisha Shah to rethink this space. It's a very uncritical concept. It's just taking the world as self-evident and as written. And as a result of this, there's no option but to conclude that territory ceases to be important, because there's quite clearly interaction, even within Europe, between Paris and Berlin, or between Pisa and Edinburgh, where we all are. And so when we only think of the world very much structured as this kind of jigsaw puzzle, like neat fitting in of the way, the dominance of the geopolitical geography tends to take priority. And these are just some examples of, so Georg Schwarzenberger is a kind of a key touchstone, but there are many other, I have to say, predominantly male international lawyers from old who tend to think in these terms. And what emerges in my assessment is that the orthodox concept of territory for international lawyers is a statocentric concept, that it's flat, that is only, and what I mean by flat is it's only one layer deep. So we only ever see either these jigsaw puzzles fitting together neatly. This was something from a really interesting article by Karen Knopp. And it's also demonstrated in Crawford's work, where you understand territorial sovereignty, or res nullius or res communis, but they never overlap. You would never find a res nullius space that overlaps with territorial sovereignty. So we're still seeing the world in a very flat, only one layer deep way. There's also very much a dominance of a naturalized concept of territory. And we see this in even the language, that territorial waters are an opponent to land territory. That the only reason why water even exists in state territory at all is as an accessory, if you like, to the land. And so the land is really fetishized, if I might put it that way, in this. And when ICJ is working on cases to do with territorial disputes, they often are using words like inherently or naturally like this, which assumes this very natural understanding. And related to that is a very physicalized understanding, where you tend to prioritize land. And then related to that is also the idea that it's permanent. Territory, if we conflate it with the physical and the natural world, we tend to think of it as a very stabilized entity. In critical geography, of course, we know this is not true. We have tides, which international law really also tries to struggle with the concept, but rocks move, continents move, but it's a very long, if you like, and deep time. It also shows a certain impulse towards stability or order, which is kind of very pervasive of international law discourse. And as a result, territory just becomes this static background. And so I also argue that this understanding is slightly illiterate, and I use that in a very broad sense, because when you look at international law discourse, sometimes even within the same sentence, the author moves between understanding or describing territory as land, area, space, portions of the earth. An area has a very 2D or two-dimensional understanding, whereas space is a much more affective and affected 3 or 4 or even 5-dimensional concept of that particular portion, if you like, or slice of what we're looking at. And it is as a result of a cartographically disciplined imagination. Cartography as a discipline broadly for most of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century sees the world in a very two-dimensional way. It tends to see geopolitical maps. It sees them as flat. It sees them as natural and physical, so that the land you see or we think of as on the map is exactly the same as the natural or the physical world. Maps also, unless you're looking at a very dynamic an ever-changing map, and probably your best example is Google or some kind of open source map. But when we look at the atlas that we all potentially grew up looking at, the time of that atlas is frozen from the moment that it is made. So as a result, there is no other outcome that is logical other than aterritoriality. So in some ways, it's not international lawyers' fault. If we make these assumptions about the orthodox concept, this is how we struggle to ever understand territory as something other. And we will always, when we see non-state actors, fail to see their spaces, and we will always, as a result, produce aterritorial and aspatial. And so I wanted to ask in the book, what happens if we instead see territories as multiplying, as multiple, and as becoming more heterogeneous? There is an understanding and an acceptance, I think, increasingly in international law that borders are much more heterogeneous and multiplying. There's a really excellent set of Marxist scholars, Brett and Nelson, who work on border as method, and this is really has influenced my thinking quite extensively. And one of the key arguments they make is that borders in and of itself have their own time. We can speed up time of going through borders. And so when I was reading this book, I was asking myself, well, what happens if time itself is also, the time of territory is also different? And what if territories could possibly overlap in more than one layer or imaginary of the world? And if so, how exactly then are territories produced or created? Because if they're only produced by the state or created by the state, then we will always only have a statocentric concept. And so I really went back to first order principles. And so the second part of the book tries to rethink, or I think, say, kind of take reterritorialization seriously, to understand territory as socially produced space, and as a continual process. It's not a case of just planting a flag in our old traditional sense on an island or on the moon and claiming, but this action of claiming and doing and acting within space has to be a continual process. It's very much influenced by work by a critical geographer called Doreen Massey, who even argues that you participate in continually recreating that space every single time. For example, you take the same train journey. For her, it was a journey from London to Milton Keynes, where she worked. But every single time you're participating and you're not disrupting the space, you're continuing to produce the space as a status quo. But in order to do that, you need to slightly reinterpret the relationship between territory and the physical world. That territory is not the physical world or the brute facts of atoms, but is either representative of, which is often the way that we turn to. But that still, to me, is too conceptually flat. But we instead see territory as something entirely separate from the physical world. As to what actually constitutes territory, I argue that it's a practice of control. And I talk in the book a little bit about why I use the word control, because we could also use, in a more Foucauldian sense, disciplining of the space, so the disciplining of the activities, the businesses, the lives, the schooling, the education, the health, everything. We could also use the term use of land, but this to me then slightly reverts back into a position that the likes of Mario Prost and others have critiqued, of only thinking of the natural or physical world as something that is a resource or something to use, and then we end up stuck in this we end up captured by this idea of exploitative, extractive narratives. And so in the book, I then think about who does what controlling, and in relation to who and to what. And traditionally, it's just that this has always been, or not always been, but for much of or we imagine or assume that for much of the 20th century, it was very much centralized in the state bureaucracy, but that in and of itself is a story that we can really pull apart. But we can see these practices of control as potentially being done by many more actors than just the state. It involves rethinking the time of territory, and I do this in an article on tax havens to imagine that what happens if we are potentially creating and recreating a new territory every single time certain offshore books are opened or offshore email accounts are opened. It rethinks how we bound territory, or the bordering of territory, to not see territory as a container that is then filled with the content or legal personality of the state, but that the bounding of territories might shift and change on a temporal or daily or basis. There's a very clear example, or an easy example of this, which is a as an island between Spain and France, which every 6 months changes. The state changes, but I argue this could be done on a much more fluid and less kind of ritualistic basis. And it also allows us to rethink our representation of territory not as a homogeneous whole, that within that there's always some kind of container for an actor, but that territory could potentially be more like networks, more like lines of flow rather than neat jigsaw puzzles. And so I really like this piece of artwork by, he was born in Uzbekistan, an artist called Alexander Kedrin, who looks at, it's called the Garden of the Winds, but here you can see the more traditional understanding of the hatched-based state like jigsaw puzzle pieces, but the lines of flow and shifting and relations are very kind of in the penetration within some of these different actors. I really like its visual representation. So why the rethink? Because people could just ignore me, and that's completely fine. They don't have to believe or listen to anything that I say, but I think there's an important politics behind both the existing territorial status quo, but there's an important shift that's taking place amongst international organizations and multinational corporations, which are challenging that status quo of state territory, and we're missing their politics. So we are missing those other dynamics that non-state actors and the way in which states and non-states compete every single day in minute terms or grand terms. But it also allows us to contest space. Us as individuals or as activists or as academics or as people working in NGOs, if we understand that we can contest this space and we can disrupt it in many, I argue that it means that the future can be very much open. And so this is a quote from Doreen Massey, who talks about if we can conceive the future as open, then we can engage or accept different kinds of politics. And it's only when we see space as closed, then there can be very little radical intervention. And so I really like this piece of work by an African artist, Pamela Fatsimo Sundstrom, who very much works with the idea of Afrofuturisms. And there's a really interesting amount of work that's done on Afrofuturism, but has a very different concept of space and the relation of the body to space. And her work really explores this in a really interesting way. But in essence, it's more to say that we can, if we see space as closed, then, and we can't disrupt space to challenge even at a local level, like a ban on protests. And so from the very local to, of banning protests in a particular area, by them refusing to accept that spatial disciplining and to hold a protest in an area, all the way up to the global, we can continually contest space. And so this is why I think thinking this way or rethinking this way is important. But also, I hope, helps makes more sense of law. And this is where my book then maybe turns a little bit more conservative, because it then, and it was mostly because I had in mind an international law audience, and I wanted to show them that this more open, radical contestation of space could still exist within, or be made sense of within their disciplinary protocols. And so I very much use what's called American legal realism, which is very distinct, if you like, from IR realism. But it's an American legal realist account of sovereignty, which I adopt, which in many ways I just call the spatializing of Hochfeld's bundle of legal relations. So if we make contracts with one another, these contracts have a time and a space. When we create new legal persons, those, whether that's a corporation or a charity, they have their own legal relations. And very much influenced as well by American legal realism work, where they challenged the idea of ownership and challenged the idea that we don't have a relationship between ourselves and our possessions. So this pen, for example, we often think of ownership as a relationship between me and this pen, but really the way instead we should understand this legal relationship is actually a relationship between me and you, that I have a right to use this pen because I own it. And so it helps us rethink this idea of exclusivity in international law, which otherwise excludes the idea that other actors can overlap in relation to the same physical space. There was a famous book that came out, I think 2 years ago now, on RIP sovereignty, where Don Herzog wanted to bury or rest in peace the concept of sovereignty because he didn't find it a helpful concept. And I instead propose that we bury the concept or do away with or entirely throw away the concept of territorial sovereignty, because Title II otherwise understands territory as an object that's capable of ownership as opposed to a space that's created through actions. And if we want to keep using the term sovereignty as a nebulous, potentially unhelpful term, then by all means, we can continue it, but it's more, I think, territorial sovereignty that's problematic in international law discourse. And I also argue that there's many more, or I try to rethink that relationship between jurisdiction and territory. And I think it was, I can't remember who it was now, was it Jenks? I do quote it in the book, who argued that it's a bit like a murky swamp, this relationship between the concepts of jurisdiction and the concept of territory. And in the book, I argue that there's nothing extra or exceptional or different about extraterritoriality. I just published a piece in the Leiden Journal that looks into this O'Keefe and Krish debate a little bit more, to again really rethink this, not territory as this, or jurisdiction as this. If territory and jurisdiction always exist together, we often again have this container idea of territoriality, whereas extraterritoriality has an explanation for why states undertake activities, actions, disciplining, law creation, enforcement activities outside of their own territory. And so if we can rethink that as also then potentially expanding their territorial reach for those moments, it just allows us to see it better. And in the book, I choose 3 case studies for seeing like an international organization. And I kept it within the broadly what we might call public law arena, because it was just too much to deal with within the book, whereas my current work is more thinking through private law. But I choose 3 case studies. One was the EU, because the EU is already more or less informally and imprecisely accepted as having some kind of territorial presence. It's got, but it's a very container-like presence we often assume it has. I also chose the International Seabed Authority because it did not overlap state space. And so to show the International Seabed Authority as having control in relation to the area or the seabed. And just to change things up, I show in the final case study that it's also possible to follow the function. So rather than just following the actor or seeing like the actor, it's also possible to, for example, take a competence or a sector like health, like trade, like international investment law, and to see the function or the competence and how it has shifted. And so I use the example of data because there's been a lot of excellent work done on data by the likes of Fleur Johns and others. So it was a very obvious and easy case to make. So I think I'll end there. I'm very happy to deal with any questions. Hopefully that's in time. And if you are interested, because the book is quite expensive, there is a little discount code which I'm happy to share with you all. So I will.